Welcome to this Campaign 2022 reality check. I'm political specialist Sean Boyd. Here with our CBS 4 analyst, Republican Dick Wadhams, Democrat Mike Dino. The story making political headlines in Colorado this week has to do with some shenanigans by Democrats. The Dems have dropped millions of dollars on ads and flyers aimed at helping certain Republican candidates. It's all part of a ruse by liberals to get GOP primary voters to nominate far-right conservatives who Democrats see as easier to beat in the general election. The beneficiaries? Ron Hanks in the U.S. Senate primary, Greg Lopez in the gubernatorial race, and Lori Sain in Congressional District 8. Dick, they tried this before, and it's worked. Will it work again?
It has. The significance to me, though, Sean, is that for this entire election, the Democrats have said, oh, Colorado's off the table. Colorado's a blue state. We are not worried at all about all of our Democratic candidates. All of a sudden, they're dumping millions of dollars into these races to try to nominate who they think are the weakest candidates. So their polling must be showing this state's very competitive, and Republicans could win these elections. And I agree with them. I think that Republicans are competitive in this election.
You know, Mike, it's interesting. I can't help but think, these are the very candidates that Democrats say are a threat to democracy, and yet they're pushing them onto the ballot. People didn't think that Trump would win.
Well, I do think rational Republicans have been wringing their hands for most of this year about these very extreme candidates. And I think the Democrats finally heard him and says, let's figure out how to get them elected and then take them on in the fall because we got a better chance. A lot of this stems back to, in 2010, the Citizens United decision that really opened up the ability for third parties, independent expenditure committees to go out and do this stuff. And I do think Republicans have been against any type of campaign reform. I think that's where the big problem really is. But when you break it down for Colorado, I think it's a good tactic for Democrats. I don't think it's just liberal Democrats doing it. I think it's Democrats, across the board that see this as a good strategy.
Yeah, but Dick is right. This was considered, you think of the race with Polis, right? I mean, they're dumping all this money into making sure that Greg Lopez is the candidate over Heidi Ganahl. That says to me that they're a little bit worried about whether Polis is going to win this.
I think you should be worried every election. Nothing's a slam dunk. We know there's a lot of different things that are going through the ether in terms of the economy, the abortion issue, January 6th, and it's just going to be hard to figure out what's going to get voters' attention. So my view is, all things are fair in this election.
And Sean, independent expenditures, they started long before 2010, Mike. I mean, my Lord, the campaigns I ran before 2010, we were assaulted by Democratic independent expenditures. And by the way, Republicans did too. So, but it didn't start in 2010.
Yeah, but the Citizens United allowed corporations.
And labor unions.
And labor unions too.
Yes.
And so it allows them to have a voice that is a little bit shady to
They always
voters.
had. They had that before 2010. But anyway.
Every election, there's some new tactic, right?
Yeah.
Well, coming up, could congressional hearings on January 6th impact the election? And if so, how? That's next. Welcome again to our Campaign 2022 weekly reality check. For the first time this week, we heard from some of President Trump's closest advisors about what really happened in the lead up to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The committee investigating the violence played testimony from, among others, former President Trump's campaign manager, Attorney General, and daughter Ivanka. All of them said the election was not stolen. The Attorney General calling claims of fraud crazy. He says he and others repeatedly told the president, who he described as detached from reality, that he needed to accept defeat. He refused. Mike, you think this is going to change the minds of any election deniers?
No. And even nationwide, over 50% of Republicans still think the election was stolen. Or there was a considerable amount of fraud. And so I don't think it'll change Republicans' minds, and it'll further fortify Democrats' minds that, this was a horrible event. If you watched the Thursday night last Thursday and you watched the live video at the Capitol and invading the Capitol, it was just horrifying. And so I think that in Colorado, we have a large unaffiliated registered voting population. I'd like to think it will change their minds, and we'll see in terms of their enthusiasm at showing up at the ballot box, both in the primary and in the general.
I don't know, Dick, I thought this was just some powerful testimony. You know, these are people really close to the president. And we also learned how the president's supporters donated this $250 million to this bogus, really, legal defense fund, and the money instead went to his hotels and his PAC. I interviewed the gubernatorial candidates this week, Heidi Canal and Greg Lopez, and both of them told me he shares some of the blame for this, you know. What do you think?
I think he's responsible for a great deal of the blame, Sean. I remain absolutely appalled by his behavior. His behavior since the election up through January 6th and even today has been reprehensible, and that's all there is to it. And I appreciate what the committee is revealing. It's not a surprising revelation, but it is very compelling. Now, having said that, I still think most voters, as disgusted as they will be with the president's behavior, he's not on the ballot in November, but inflation and crime are on the ballot, essentially. President Biden is president, and I will tell you, when people go to the gas pump or when they go to the grocery store, that's what's going to be on their minds in November, and it should be. But I have no apology, no defense at all of President Trump and his horrible behavior. None.
But as I asked Mike, do you think these election deniers out there, do you think this is going to change the minds of any of those election deniers? And really, how many of them are single-issue voters, that they're going to vote on this, that they're going to vote for the more extreme Republican candidate based on this?
I hate to say it, but they will not be changed. And a big chunk, and Mike is right, a big chunk of the polling shows, but I also experienced it just in going to Republican events. So many of my fellow Republicans are absolutely insistent that Donald Trump is the one true president. It is mind-boggling to me, but it is a reality.
Well, look at the Pennsylvania polling in the governor's race. The Republicans nominated a hugely extreme election denier, pro-Trump guy, and now the race is even for that race. And so I think that you're going to see, that be a factor in people continuing to support those folks who have denied the election.
Yeah, you think of Liz Cheney and what's going to happen to her. I mean, clearly all the signs are that she's going to lose her primary.
In South Carolina the other night, Sean, Tom Rice, who had like 100% voting record supporting Trump and a conservative record, and he goes down by 3 to 1.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, coming up, we're going to talk about turnout so far in Colorado's primary, and the numbers may surprise you. Welcome back again to our weekly Campaign 2022 reality check. We are less than 2 weeks away from the primary election, an election where Republicans were expected to turn out in big numbers, but as of right now, more Democrats than Republicans have cast their ballots. It's close, but still, Democrats are edging out Republicans right now. So, Dick, do you think that Republicans are waiting to cast their ballots in person?
Well, I haven't cast mine yet, but I will be. I think Republicans might be hanging back. We have all these competitive primaries on the Republican side, and they're starting to see all these ads now. And so I'm starting to think that Republicans are kind of waiting until the end. I do expect a surge of Republicans at the end that will surpass Democrats, and I also anticipate more unaffiliated will vote in the Republican primary than we've seen in the past. Now, let me point out, if that doesn't happen, that's a bad sign for Republicans. We have to get turnout in this primary.
Why? More unaffiliated voting in the Republican primary because they have choices,
They do. And I think that we've got to show some enthusiasm among Republicans, and we've got to show that unaffiliateds lean towards Republicans in this election. That's very important.
But they're not holding on to their ballots because they don't want to put them in the mail because they're afraid they might disappear in the mail. Most of them are holding on right now because they're just trying to make their minds up.
There will be some Republicans who are still concerned about the integrity of the election process, who might be holding them onto them, and they're going to drive them to the courthouse. I don't know, but not the vast majority. So
Mike, do you think Democrats what is your sense? I mean, you talk with Democrats. Are they more enthused than what we might have expected in a midterm election?
I do think Democrats are motivated by what they've seen with the January 6th hearings. I think They also feel that their vote is a voice against the fraud and the stealing claims that the extreme Republicans have made. And that, while there's not much on the ballot, and that makes it easy, you just look at it and go, gosh, there's not much for me to do. All I got to do is either put in a stamp or, in my neighborhood, walk a few blocks to drop it off to the rec center. I mean, it's easy to vote for Dems this time around, at least on the Front Range for the most part. I mean, certainly there's competitive races on the West Slope, and maybe people are taking more time. But I think Dems have also had a little more turnout usually in the last few cycles.
Yes.
And where I'm paying attention to is the unaffiliateds, and talking with Dick, 400,000 unaffiliated voters turned out in 2020. 300,000 voted in the Democratic primary, and 100,000 voted on the Republican primary. And that, to me, is really indicative of what's going to happen in November. Who are those unaffiliateds going to vote for? They favored the Dems in 2020, and I think that'll be the Dems saving grace in Colorado in 2022.
And I agree, Sean, that will be the indicator. If we don't have more unaffiliateds vote in our primary this time than Dems, that's a real bad sign. By the way, if I were a Democrat, I'd write Mike Dino's name in on the ballot.
Well, of course they're going to vote on the Republican side, though, because they don't have much choice on the Democratic side. You look at the ballots and you go, okay, well, it's all just one person to vote for, but you have all these choices on the Republican side.
If an unaffiliated voter really doesn't like Republicans and hates Trump and thinks that Republicans are still bound by Trump, they're not going to vote in our primary. I honestly think that if they take a Republican ballot, it's a sign that they think Republicans offer something this election. So we'll see.
Well, that bodes well for the moderates that are on the ballot.
I agree.
Then.
Yeah.
Mike, do you sense that many Democrats are switching just for the primary? Let's switch party affiliation and vote in the Republican primary, and then switch back and be a Democrat?
Not on the Front Range, but certainly it has been documented that several thousand, maybe upwards of 5,000, have already switched Democrats to unaffiliated so they can vote in the Republican primary.
In the 3rd district.
In the 3rd district, excuse me, in the 3rd district on the West Slope. And I think as Dick and I looked at the numbers 2 years ago in that primary, that's still not enough to turn the tide with how many votes that Congresswoman Boebert got out, particularly Mesa County.
Right.
But nonetheless, there are Dems that are making an effort.
Wouldn't that be a shock if quorum came out on top of Boebert?
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't expect her to be tipped in. You never know in this state, right?
Yeah.
No.
All right, a lot at stake this election, and we will be back next week as the races continue to heat up in advance of the June 28th primary that will set the stage for November.